"Leave her behind, she'll only slow us down." Those were my mother's exact words as she abandoned me on a collapsing mountain trail while enemy forces closed in. But what my parents didn't know was that a team of Navy SEALs was already tracking our location, and they were about to witness the most cowardly act of betrayal imaginable. I'm Riley Thornfield, 26 years old, former humanitarian aid coordinator, and the daughter of two people who chose their own survival over mine in the most critical moment of my life. What started as a family volunteer mission in the war-torn mountains of Carvania became the day I learned that blood doesn't always run thicker than water. Sometimes it runs cold as ice. My parents thought they were saving themselves by leaving me to die. They had no idea they were about to face the wrath of Elite Team Bravo 6, and more importantly, they had no clue that their abandoned daughter would survive to expose every selfish, calculating decision they made that day. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about justice, betrayal, and how sometimes the family you choose becomes stronger than the family you're born into. Have you ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you most? Stay with me. Hit that subscribe button, because this story will show you how I turned the worst day of my life into the foundation for something extraordinary. My name is Riley Thornfield, and I grew up in the affluent suburbs of Millbrook Heights, Colorado. My father, Jonathan Thornfield, was a successful environmental consultant who built his reputation on saving the world one project at a time. At least that's what his business card said. My mother, Victoria Thornfield, ran a high-end nonprofit organization called Global Hearts Initiative that organized volunteer missions for wealthy families wanting to feel good about themselves while posting Instagram photos from impoverished regions. To the outside world, we were the perfect humanitarian family, the Thornfields who cared about others, who traveled to remote corners of the world to make a difference, who raised their daughter to be socially conscious and globally aware. What people didn't see was the cold calculation behind every charitable act, the way my parents measured every good deed against the social media engagement it would generate, and how they viewed compassion as a currency to be spent strategically. I was their prop in this performance. The dutiful daughter who spoke 3 languages, had spent summers building schools in Guatemala and water systems in rural Kenya, who looked perfect in their annual Christmas cards featuring our latest humanitarian adventure. But behind the carefully curated photos, I was drowning in their expectations, suffocating under the weight of being their walking, talking proof of moral superiority. Unlike the golden child favoritism that destroys some families, my parents treated me like their prized project. I wasn't ignored, I was molded, shaped, controlled. Every decision I made had to align with their image. When I wanted to study marine biology, they steered me toward international development. When I wanted to backpack through Europe with friends, they enrolled me in a volunteer program in Honduras instead. My life wasn't mine, it was theirs to choreograph. The irony wasn't lost on me that we helped strangers around the world while I felt like a stranger in my own home. I learned to speak the language of humanitarian work fluently, not because I didn't care about helping others, but because it was the only way to communicate with my parents. Every conversation revolved around our next mission, our impact metrics, our growing reputation in philanthropic circles. But there was always something that felt hollow about their compassion. I noticed how they interacted differently when cameras weren't rolling, how their smiles faded the moment the local news crews left, and how they complained privately about the living conditions in the very communities they publicly claimed to love serving. Still, I convinced myself that the work mattered, that even if their motivations were mixed, we were genuinely helping people. That naive belief shattered completely on March 15, 2024, during what was supposed to be our family's most ambitious mission yet. The Global Hearts Initiative had partnered with the International Relief Coalition to establish emergency medical stations in Carvania, a small mountain nation torn apart by civil conflict. The project was massive: 6 months of planning, significant funding, and extensive media coverage. This was going to be the mission that catapulted my parents into the upper echelon of humanitarian celebrities. I should have recognized the red flags.
The way my father obsessed over the documentary crew that would be following us, how my mother spent more time planning our wardrobe for the cameras than studying the actual crisis we were supposed to be addressing. The fact that they seemed more excited about the CNN interview scheduled for our return than the medical supplies we were delivering to desperate families. But I was 26 and still hungry for their approval, still hoping that maybe this time, in this remote and dangerous place, I would finally see the parents I'd always wanted them to be, the ones who put human dignity above public relations, who chose courage over convenience, and who loved their daughter more than their image. I was about to learn exactly what they valued most, and it wasn't me. The morning we left for Carvania, Victoria hugged me at the airport and whispered, "This is going to change everything for our family, Riley. People will remember the Thornfield name forever." She was right about that, but not in the way she imagined.
What happened in those mountains didn't just change everything, it revealed everything. And when you strip away all the pretense, all the carefully constructed humanitarian facade, what remains is the truth about who people really are when their backs are against the wall. My parents failed that test in the most spectacular way possible, but I didn't just survive their failure, I turned it into the blueprint for the life I was always meant to live. This is that story. Growing up in the Thornfield household meant living inside a perfectly curated museum of moral superiority. Our 3-story colonial home in Millbrook Heights wasn't just a residence, it was a shrine to humanitarian achievement. Every wall displayed framed photos of my parents shaking hands with village elders, certificates of appreciation from international organizations, and newspaper clippings celebrating their latest charitable endeavors. The living room featured a massive world map dotted with red pins marking every location where the Thornfield family had made a difference. Guatemala, Kenya, Bangladesh, Nepal, Cambodia, a constellation of good deeds that guests would admire while sipping wine at my mother's fundraising dinner parties. But what those guests didn't see were the private moments that revealed the machinery behind the magic. I remember being 12 years old, sitting at our kitchen island doing homework while my parents planned their upcoming mission to build a school in rural Peru. I listened as they debated not the educational needs of the children they'd be serving, but which social media platforms would generate the most engagement from their documentation efforts. Instagram posts get more immediate response, Victoria said, scrolling through analytics on her laptop. But the LinkedIn articles position us as thought leaders for corporate sponsors. What about the actual school construction timeline? I asked, innocently. My father barely looked up from his phone. The local contractors handle that, Riley. Our job is to maximize the impact of our presence there. That was my first glimpse behind the curtain, though it would take years for me to fully understand what I was seeing. My parents weren't evil people. They genuinely believed they were making the world better, but somewhere along the way, the mission had become secondary to the recognition, the impact subordinated to the image. As I grew older, this dynamic became the foundation of our family relationships. Love was expressed through mission trips, bonding happened during volunteer projects, and approval was earned by how photogenic I looked while helping others. Family dinner conversations revolved around logistics for upcoming humanitarian expeditions or analysis of the media coverage from recent ones. Riley demonstrated exceptional cultural sensitivity during the water well dedication ceremony, Jonathan would tell visitors, as if I were a project to be evaluated rather than his daughter to be celebrated. She's developing into quite the young humanitarian. I learned to perform compassion as fluently as I performed being the perfect daughter. Smile at the right moments, ask thoughtful questions about local customs, demonstrate genuine concern for the communities we served, all while cameras rolled and my parents beamed with pride at their perfectly trained humanitarian protege. The strangest part was that I did care about the work.
Genuinely. When we built that school in Peru, I spent hours teaching English to the local children after the official work was done. In Kenya, I stayed up late learning Swahili so I could communicate directly with the families we were helping. In Bangladesh, I researched water purification methods on my own time because I wanted to understand the technical challenges beyond just participating in the ceremonial groundbreaking. But every authentic moment of connection I experienced was immediately co-opted by my parents' publicity machine. The photo of me reading with children in Peru became the cover image for their annual donor newsletter. My conversations with women in Kenya were edited into a promotional video that played at fundraising galas. My technical questions about water systems in Bangladesh were reframed as evidence of the next generation of Thornfield environmental justice advocacy. I began to feel like I was drowning in their expectations while simultaneously being denied the oxygen of genuine recognition for who I actually was versus who they needed me to be. They loved the version of me that enhanced their reputation, but I wasn't sure they even knew the real me existed. High school became an exercise in strategic positioning. While my classmates worried about SAT scores and college applications, I was being groomed for a life of perpetual performance. My parents enrolled me in advanced language courses, international relations seminars, and leadership development programs, all designed to make me the perfect heir to their humanitarian empire. Riley has such a gift for connecting with people from different cultures, Victoria would tell anyone who would listen. She's going to change the world someday. But I didn't want to change the world in the same way they did. I wanted to change it quietly, authentically, without press releases and donor galas and strategic partnerships with corporate sponsors looking for tax write-offs. I wanted to help people because they needed help, not because helping them would look good on our Christmas cards. The breaking point came during my senior year when I expressed interest in studying marine biology at a small liberal arts college in Oregon. I'd fallen in love with ocean conservation during a family mission to coastal Ecuador. But instead of supporting my passion, my parents immediately began redirecting it toward their purposes. Marine biology is too narrow, Jonathan explained during one of our family planning sessions. Meetings that felt more like corporate strategy discussions than conversations between parents and their daughter. Environmental humanitarian work has much broader impact potential. Think about it. You could be the next generation of Thornfield environmental justice advocacy. But I want to study coral reef restoration specifically. There's so much we don't understand about ocean ecosystem recovery.
That's exactly what I'm talking about, Victoria jumped in, her eyes lighting up with the familiar glow that appeared whenever she saw a new opportunity for public recognition. Coral reef restoration in developing nations. Climate change impact on indigenous coastal communities. Ocean conservation as humanitarian crisis response. Riley, you could be speaking at the United Nations by the time you're 30. They weren't listening to me. They were listening to the sound of their own voices describing the daughter they wanted me to become. And in that moment, I realized that no matter how far I traveled with them, no matter how many communities we served together, I would always be a supporting character in their story, rather than the protagonist of my own. So I made a decision that would change everything. I agreed to one more family mission, their most ambitious project yet in the conflict zones of Carvania, but I privately decided it would be my last. After this, I would find a way to forge my own path, even if it meant disappointing the two people who had shaped my entire identity around being their perfect humanitarian daughter. I thought the biggest challenge would be telling them about my decision to break away from their expectations. I had no idea that the mountains of Carvania would reveal just how expendable I really was in their calculations, and how quickly their performative love would evaporate when their own survival was at stake. Sometimes the people who teach you the most about human nature
are the ones who show you exactly what you never want to become. If my parents were the architects of my perfectly curated humanitarian identity, Captain Daniel Bear Morrison was the first person who saw me for who I actually was underneath all that careful construction. I met him during what my parents called our pre-deployment consultation for the Carvania mission, a fancy term for the security briefing that international aid organizations require before sending teams into active conflict zones. Bear Morrison didn't look like what I'd imagined a military consultant would look like. Yes, he was built like someone who could bench press a small car, and yes, his handshake could probably crack walnuts, but his eyes held a warmth that seemed almost out of place in the sterile conference room where we first met. He was maybe 45, with graying temples and laugh lines that suggested someone who'd found ways to maintain his humanity, despite whatever he'd seen in the world's darkest corners. "So you're the Thornfield family," he said, settling into his chair across from us at the International Relief Coalition's Denver headquarters. "I've been following your work for a while now. Impressive portfolio." My parents practically glowed. This was exactly the kind of recognition they lived for. Validation from someone's credentials couldn't be questioned. Bear's resume was intimidating. 22 years in the Navy SEALs, multiple deployments in every major conflict zone of the past 2 decades, and now running private security consulting for humanitarian organizations operating in high-risk areas. "Captain Morrison," my father began, launching into what I recognized as his standard presentation mode, "we believe that humanitarian work requires accepting certain calculated risks in service of the greater good." "Call me Bear," he interrupted gently. "And you're absolutely right about the risks. That's why I'm here, to make sure those calculations don't get anyone killed." For the next 2 hours, Bear walked us through the realities of operating in Carvania. The civil conflict had been raging for 3 years, with government forces and rebel militias controlling different territories that shifted almost daily. The mountain regions where we'd be working were particularly volatile, with both sides using the terrain to launch surprise attacks on each other and anyone caught between them. "The medical stations you're planning to establish are in villages that have changed hands 4 times in the past 6 months. Bear explained, pointing to locations on a detailed topographical map. "Both sides need medical care, which means both sides will either welcome you or suspect you of helping their enemies. There's no neutral ground in this kind of conflict." My parents nodded along, but I could tell they were only half listening. They were more interested in how dangerous the mission sounded for promotional purposes than in the actual implications of that danger. Victoria kept taking notes that I suspected had more to do with dramatic story elements than security protocols. But Bear was watching me, and I realized he could see exactly what I was thinking. "Riley," he said suddenly, addressing me directly for the first time, "what questions do you have about the mission?" The question caught me off guard. My parents usually answered for me in professional settings, positioning me as the dutiful daughter following their lead rather than someone with independent thoughts about the work we were doing. I hesitated, glancing at my parents, then back at Bear. Something in his expression encouraged honesty. "I'm wondering about the local medical infrastructure. If we're setting up emergency stations, what happens to ongoing care after we leave? Are we creating dependency or building sustainable capacity?" Bear's eyebrows went up slightly, and I caught the hint of a smile. "That's exactly the right question to ask. Most people focus on the immediate impact without thinking about long-term consequences." He leaned forward, suddenly more engaged. "What's your background in public health?" "I don't have formal training," I admitted, "but I've been researching community health models that can operate independently after international aid teams withdraw. I think there might be ways to structure our medical stations so they can transition to local management within 6 months."
For the next 20 minutes, Bear and I fell into a conversation about sustainable humanitarian infrastructure that completely excluded my parents. He knew details about successful community health programs in similar conflict zones, and I found myself sharing ideas I'd never voiced before, not because my parents wouldn't listen, but because they'd immediately tried to turn them into promotional talking points. Bear listened without interrupting, asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and treating my ideas like they came from a colleague rather than a charity project mascot. It was the first time in years that someone had engaged with my thoughts about humanitarian work without immediately calculating how those thoughts could enhance their own reputation. "Have you considered field medicine training?" he asked eventually. "What you're describing would require someone on the ground who understands both the medical protocols and the community dynamics. Most aid workers specialize in one or the other." "Riley's role is more focused on cultural liaison and documentation," my father interjected, clearly uncomfortable with how far the conversation had drifted from their planned narrative. "We have medical professionals handling the technical aspects." Bear nodded politely at my father, then turned back to me. "Cultural liaison is crucial work, but if you're serious about sustainable community health, you might want to think about expanding your skill set. I know some programs that train humanitarian workers in field medicine specifically for situations like Carvenia." That was the moment I realized Bear saw something in me that my parents had never recognized, potential that existed independently of their agenda. He wasn't trying to mold me into the vision of what I should become. He was identifying capabilities I already had and suggesting ways to develop them further. After the briefing ended and my parents were busy networking with other International Relief Coalition staff, Bear approached me in the parking lot. "Riley, I want to give you something." He handed me a satellite phone, military grade and more sophisticated than anything I'd seen before. "This is configured to reach emergency frequencies that work even in remote mountain terrain. The battery life is 48 hours on standby, and it's got GPS tracking capability." "Thank you," I said, surprised by the gesture. "But won't the team has communication equipment?" "They will," Bear nodded, "but this one is just for you. If anything happens, and I mean anything, you use this to call for help. The emergency frequency connects directly to coalition forces operating in the region. They'll be able to track your location and respond accordingly." He paused, studying my face with an intensity that made me feel like he was seeing something I didn't even know was there. "Riley, I've been doing this kind of work for more than 2 decades, and I've learned to trust my instincts about people. You have something most humanitarian workers don't. You see systems instead of just problems. That's valuable, but it also means you notice things that other people might prefer you didn't notice." I wasn't sure what he meant by that, but something in his tone made me take the satellite phone more seriously. In conflict zones, the most dangerous situations aren't always the obvious ones. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you make decisions based on calculations that don't include your well-being. If that happens, you call the number I've programmed in this phone. Don't hesitate, don't second-guess yourself, and don't worry about offending anyone. Your life is worth more than anyone's feelings. At the time, I thought he was giving me standard security advice. Looking back, I wonder if Bear Morrison somehow knew exactly what kind of people my parents were, and exactly what kind of calculations they might make when their backs were against a wall. 3 weeks later, as I lay injured and abandoned on a mountain trail in Carvenia, his words would prove to be the difference between life and death. But in that moment, standing in a Denver parking lot, I just felt grateful that someone finally saw me as more than a supporting character in someone else's humanitarian success story. Bear Morrison was the first person who made me believe I might be capable of writing my own story. He had no idea he was about to become part of it in the most dramatic way possible. The 3 weeks between Bear's security briefing and our departure for Carvenia became a turning point in ways I never could have anticipated. For the first time in my life, I had a secret project that belonged entirely to me, something my parents couldn't co-opt, couldn't photograph, and couldn't turn into content for their next fundraising presentation. Bear had given me more than just a satellite phone. He'd given me a list of field medicine training resources specifically designed for humanitarian workers operating in conflict zones. If you're serious about sustainable community health, you need to understand the medical realities on the ground level.
So, while my parents spent those 3 weeks planning photo opportunities and coordinating with their documentary crew, I quietly enrolled in an intensive emergency medical training program offered by the Denver chapter of Doctors Without Borders. The course was designed for aid workers who might need to provide basic medical care in situations where professional medical staff weren't available. I told my parents I was taking additional cultural sensitivity training. Technically not a lie, since understanding medical needs is definitely part of cultural sensitivity. They approved without asking for details, too busy with their own preparations to investigate what their dutiful daughter was actually learning.
The training was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. For 12 hours a day, I learned to suture wounds, stabilize fractures, recognize signs of internal bleeding, and manage shock. The instructors were former military medics and doctors who'd worked in every conflict zone imaginable, and they didn't baby their students. If you couldn't handle the sight of blood or the pressure of making life or death decisions under stress, you washed out quickly. Humanitarian work isn't about good intentions, Dr. Sarah Kim told our class during the first week. Good intentions without competence get people killed. In the field, you need to know the difference between what you can fix and what you can't, and you need to make that assessment in 30 seconds or less. I thrived in that environment in ways that surprised even me. While my parents had always praised my natural empathy and cultural sensitivity, the medical training revealed capabilities I'd never been encouraged to develop. I had steady hands under pressure, could make quick decisions when lives were at stake, and had an intuitive understanding of how to calm panicked patients while simultaneously assessing their injuries. More importantly, I discovered that I loved the work, not the performative version of humanitarian aid that my parents practiced, but the raw, immediate reality of helping people who were genuinely suffering. There was no time for cameras or promotional materials when someone was bleeding out in front of you. There was only the work itself, pure and essential and completely authentic. During the second week of training, something happened that crystallized everything I'd been feeling about my relationship with my parents' humanitarian empire. We were practicing trauma response scenarios when one of the instructors, Mark Rodriguez, pulled me aside after a particularly intense simulation. "Riley," he said, "I've been watching you work, and I think you should know you have natural instincts for emergency medicine that can't be taught. Where did you learn to stay that calm under pressure?" The question caught me off guard because I'd never thought of myself as particularly calm under pressure. Growing up in the Thornfield household had felt like living in a constant state of low-level anxiety about meeting expectations and maintaining appearances. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "I guess I've just had a lot of practice managing stressful situations." Mark nodded thoughtfully. "Have you considered that maybe the stress you've been managing wasn't actually yours? Sometimes people who grow up in high-pressure environments develop exceptional crisis management skills because they've been navigating other people's chaos their entire lives." That observation hit me like a revelation. My parents' constant focus on image management, their endless cycle of planning and executing publicity-generating missions, their need to control every aspect of how our family was perceived, all of that had created an environment where I'd learned to stay calm and focused while everything around me felt chaotic and unpredictable. But now, for the first time, I was using those skills for something that actually mattered. When I successfully stabilized a trading partner's simulated compound fracture, when I talked a panic volunteer through a mock triage scenario, when I correctly identified the signs of internal bleeding that other students missed, those were my accomplishments, earned through my own effort and skill, not through being the perfect daughter in someone else's promotional campaign. The final week of training included a comprehensive exam that tested both practical skills and theoretical knowledge. I scored in the 95th percentile, earning certification as a Level 2 emergency medical responder qualified to work in conflict zones. When Dr. Kim handed me my certification, she said something that I wrote down in my journal that night. "Riley, you have the potential to save lives in ways that go far beyond traditional humanitarian work.
Don't let anyone convince you that your capabilities are limited to what they can envision for you. I realized she was talking about more than just medical training. She was talking about the trap I had been living in my entire life, allowing other people's limitations to define my possibilities. During those same 3 weeks, I also began quietly researching alternative paths in humanitarian work. Bear had mentioned organizations that focused on building sustainable local capacity, rather than generating publicity for international donors. I discovered groups like Partners in Health, which trained community health workers to continue medical care long after international teams departed. I learned about Engineers Without Borders, which focused on teaching local communities to maintain their own infrastructure projects. What struck me about these organizations was how different their approach was from my parents' work. Instead of swooping in to save the bay and then leaving with great photos and compelling stories, they stayed long enough to teach local communities how to save themselves. Instead of treating aid recipients as grateful beneficiaries, they treated them as capable partners who just needed access to resources and training. I began to envision a different kind of humanitarian career, one where my role would be to work myself out of a job by ensuring that communities could meet their own medical needs without depending on outside intervention. It was the opposite of the perpetual dependency model that seemed to fuel my parents' approach to charitable work. But the most significant change during those 3 weeks wasn't the medical training or the career research. It was the gradual realization that I had been living my entire life according to someone else's script, and that I actually had the power to write my own. For 26 years, my identity was Riley Thornfield, humanitarian daughter of humanitarian parents. But as I sutured practice wounds and learned to splint broken bones and studied sustainable development models, I began to understand that I could be Riley Thornfield, person who happens to do humanitarian work because she's good at it and it matters to her.
The difference seemed small, but it was actually revolutionary. It meant that my worth wasn't dependent on my parents' approval or success. It meant that my humanitarian work could be authentic rather than performative. It meant that I could make decisions based on what was right rather than what looked good. I had no idea how prophetic that shift in thinking would prove to be. In just a few weeks, I would face a situation where the difference between performing the role of the perfect daughter and trusting my own instincts would literally be the difference between life and death. But in that moment, sitting in my apartment the night before we left for Carvenia, holding my emergency medical certification and Bear's satellite phone, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete confidence in my own capabilities, independent of anyone else's expectations or approval. I was about to discover exactly how much that confidence was worth. The first 2 weeks in Carvenia felt like everything I'd imagined humanitarian work could be, but had never actually experienced. We'd established our base camp in the village of Zelenova, a mountain community that had somehow maintained its neutrality despite being surrounded by territories controlled by warring factions. The villagers welcomed us with a cautious warmth that felt more genuine than any reception we'd received during my parents' previous missions. For once, the reality matched the promotional materials. Our medical stations were actually saving lives, not just providing photo opportunities. I watched children recover from treatable infections that could have killed them without intervention. I helped elderly villagers manage chronic conditions that had gone untreated for months. Most importantly, I was using my emergency medical training in ways that made a real, measurable difference. The village elder, a woman named Katerina Valesky, had become my unofficial mentor in understanding the local medical needs. She spoke excellent English and had been a nurse before the Civil War disrupted the region's healthcare infrastructure. Working with her, I began developing the kind of sustainable community health program I'd envisioned during my training in Denver. Your parents, they are good people, Katerina told me one evening as we inventoried medical supplies by lamplight. But you, Riley, you understand something they do not.
You see that our people are not broken things to be fixed. We are capable people who need tools and knowledge to fix ourselves. That observation captured exactly what felt different about this mission. Instead of being the dutiful daughter documenting her parents' charitable work, I was functioning as an independent medical professional collaborating with local healthcare providers. My emergency medical certification had given me credibility that had nothing to do with being a Thornfield, and the villagers respected my skills rather than my family name. Even my parents seemed to notice the change in my role, though they interpreted it in their typical fashion. During our weekly satellite call with the International Relief Coalition headquarters, Jonathan proudly reported that I was demonstrating exceptional leadership potential in community health coordination. Riley has really found her calling, Victoria added, beaming at the camera. She's developing into exactly the kind of next-generation humanitarian leader we hoped she would become. I didn't correct them, but privately, I knew they were missing the point entirely. I wasn't becoming the leader they'd wanted me to be. I was discovering the leader I actually was, independent of their expectations or guidance. The breakthrough moment came during our second Friday in Zelenova, when a group of children from a neighboring village arrived at our medical station carrying their friend Dmitri, an 8-year-old boy who'd been injured in what the other children described as an explosion in the old barn. From their panicked descriptions and Dmitri's symptoms, severe burns on his arms and torso, signs of shock, possible internal injuries, I realized he'd likely been hurt by an unexploded ordnance left over from recent fighting in the area. My parents were in the capital city of Karvenia that day, meeting with government officials about expanding our medical station network. The documentary crew was with them, filming what would become promotional footage about high-level diplomatic coordination. Our primary physician, Dr. Werner, had been called to an emergency in another village. I was alone with 2 medical assistants who had basic training but no experience with trauma cases this severe. In that moment, everything from my emergency medical training crystallized into focused action. I stabilized Dimitri's vital signs, managed his pain, and began the careful process of cleaning and treating his burns while simultaneously assessing for internal injuries. The medical assistants watched in amazement as I worked with a confidence and competence that surprised even me. "Riley," one of them said, "where did you learn to do this?" "Denver," I answered without looking up at my patient. 3 weeks of emergency trauma training. "Your parents never mentioned that you had medical certification." "They don't know," I replied, carefully examining Dimitri's pupils for signs of head trauma. I wanted to learn skills that would be useful here, not just look good in their reports. For the next 6 hours, I essentially ran the medical station single-handedly while Dr. Werner was unreachable and my parents were occupied with their diplomatic meetings. I treated Dimitri's injuries, coordinated his evacuation to a better-equipped facility in the provincial capital, and managed 3 other emergency cases that came in throughout the day. When Katerina saw me successfully managing multiple trauma patients simultaneously, she pulled me aside and said something that changed how I thought about my capabilities forever. "Riley, I have worked with many international medical teams over the past 3 years. Most come here thinking they will save us with their superior knowledge and equipment. But you, Riley, you understand something they do not. You see that our people are not broken things to be fixed. We are capable people who need tools and knowledge to fix ourselves."
That evening, when my parents returned from their meetings, they found the medical station running smoothly and efficiently under my coordination. The documentary crew immediately began filming my work with Dimitri and the other patients, framing it as evidence of exceptional Thornfield family humanitarian leadership spanning generations. But for the first time, I didn't care about the cameras or the narrative they were constructing. I was too busy experiencing the satisfaction of work that mattered, performed competently with results I could measure in lives improved and suffering alleviated. Dr. Werner, when he finally returned late that night, reviewed my patient notes and treatment decisions with obvious surprise. "Riley," he said, This is graduate-level emergency medicine. Where did you develop these skills? I've been training, I replied simply. Well, keep training, he said seriously. You have a natural aptitude for this work that goes far beyond what most humanitarian workers ever developed. Have you considered medical school? It was the first time anyone had ever suggested that my capabilities might extend beyond the boundaries my parents had established for my life. Medical school, becoming a doctor, developing expertise that was mine, earned through my own effort, independent of family connections or inherited reputation. That night, I video called Thomas Chen, a friend from college who'd become a trauma surgeon at Seattle General Hospital. I wanted to tell someone about the day's events who would understand the medical aspects, rather than just the promotional possibilities. Riley, Thomas said, after I described treating Dimitri and managing the medical station alone. What you did today isn't beginner's luck. That's advanced clinical judgment under pressure. You should seriously consider applying to medical school when you get back to the States. You think I could handle medical school? I asked. I think you're already handling emergency medical situations that some residents would struggle with. The question isn't whether you could handle medical school. The question is whether you want to spend the next 4 years studying instead of practicing. For the first time in my life, I had a vision of my future that belonged entirely to me. Not Riley Thornfield, humanitarian daughter following in her parents' footsteps, but Dr. Riley Thornfield, emergency physician who specialized in conflict zone medicine because she discovered she was exceptionally good at it and because the work mattered to her personally. I fell asleep that night more excited about my own possibilities than I'd ever been. I had found work I loved, developed skills I was proud of, and gained recognition from people whose opinions were based on my performance rather than my pedigree. I had no idea that less than 48 hours later, my parents would reveal exactly how expendable all of that progress was when their own survival was at stake. But in that moment, lying in my sleeping bag in a medical tent in the mountains of Carvania, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete alignment between who I was, what I was doing, and where I was headed. It was the highest point of my life, and as everyone knows, the higher you climb, the farther you have to fall. The morning of March 18th started like any other day in Zelenova, with the deceptive calm that I would later learn always precedes catastrophe. I was organizing medical supplies in our main station when Katerina burst through the tent flaps, her usual composed demeanor replaced by urgent concern. "Riley, we must leave immediately," she said, already gathering essential medications from our shelves. "The Crimson Brigade has broken through government lines. They're moving through the valley toward our village." The Crimson Brigade was the most brutal of the rebel factions fighting in Carvania, a group that had gained international notoriety for their complete disregard for humanitarian law. Unlike other militia groups that at least pretended to respect medical neutrality, the Crimson Brigade actively targeted aid workers, viewing international humanitarian presence as evidence of government collaboration. Within minutes, our peaceful medical station transformed into organized chaos. Dr. Werner coordinated the evacuation of our most critically injured patients, while I helped pack essential supplies and medications that we couldn't afford to lose. My parents, who had been meeting with village leadership about expanding our operations, suddenly appeared with expressions I'd never seen before. Genuine fear mixed with something that looked almost like calculation. "The International Relief Coalition is sending emergency extraction," my father announced, checking his satellite communicator obsessively. "Helicopters are en route, but the landing zone is at the old mining station 15 kilometers up the mountain trail. We need to move now." The next hour became a blur of desperate preparation. We could only carry what was essential: medical supplies, communication equipment, personal documents, and enough food and water for what we hoped would be a short hike to safety. Everything else, the carefully organized medical station, the community health program I'd been developing with Katerina, the equipment that represented months of planning and fundraising, would be left behind for the Crimson Brigade to destroy. The most heartbreaking part was saying goodbye to the villagers who had become more than just aid recipients. They had become colleagues, friends, and, in Katerina's case, something approaching family. She pressed a small leather journal into my hands as we prepared to leave.
my grandmother's recipes for traditional medicines for when you return to help people in other places. So you remember that healing comes from many sources, not just your Western drugs. I wanted to promise her that I would return, that this was just a temporary evacuation and we'd soon be back to continue the community health program we'd started building together. But the urgency in everyone's voices and the distant sound of gunfire echoing through the mountain valleys suggested this might be a much more permanent goodbye than any of us wanted to acknowledge.
The trail to the mining station was steep and treacherous under the best circumstances. The recent spring rains had made it muddy and slippery with loose rocks that shifted unpredictably underfoot. Dr. Werner, who was in his 60s and had never been particularly athletic, began struggling within the first hour. My father, despite his regular appearances at the gym back in Millbrook Heights, was clearly not prepared for this kind of sustained physical exertion at altitude. But my mother surprised everyone. Victoria, who normally complained about walking more than a few blocks in anything less comfortable than designer shoes, attacked the mountain trail with grim determination that suggested reserves of strength none of us had suspected she possessed. I found myself naturally taking point position, using my emergency medical training to assess the group's physical condition and pace our progress to prevent anyone from becoming dangerously exhausted. Every few hundred meters, I checked Dr. Warner's heart rate and monitored my father's increasingly labored breathing. The medical kit I'd packed included altitude sickness medication and emergency supplies that I hoped we wouldn't need. 3 hours into the hike, we encountered our first serious obstacle. A recent landslide had washed out a crucial section of the trail, leaving a gap about 4 meters wide over a steep ravine. The alternative route would add at least 2 hours to our journey, time we might not have if the Crimson Brigade was moving as quickly as intelligence reports suggested. "We can make it across," I said, studying the terrain. "The rocks are stable enough if we're careful about weight distribution and use the rope properly." Dr. Warner looked at the gap with obvious terror. "Riley, I'm not sure I can manage that kind of crossing." "You can," I assured him, already rigging a safety line using techniques I'd learned during wilderness emergency training. "I'll go first, secure the rope on the other side, and then guide each of you across individually." What happened next revealed the first crack in what I'd always assumed was a unified family commitment to humanitarian work. While I was focused on the technical aspects of getting everyone safely across the gap, I overheard a conversation between my parents that made my blood run cold. "Jonathan, be realistic," my mother was saying in a low voice. "If we're slowing down because of the others, we're putting ourselves at unnecessary risk." "The helicopter won't wait indefinitely," my father replied. "The pilot made that clear. If we're not at the extraction point within the time window, they leave without us." "So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we need to consider all our options. Dr. Werner can barely keep up as it is. If Riley insists on these elaborate safety precautions for every obstacle, we'll never make it to the extraction point in time." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were discussing the possibility of abandoning our team members if it would improve their own chances of reaching safety. These were the same people who gave speeches about humanitarian solidarity and shared sacrifice, the same people who built their entire public image around selfless service to others. But I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the immediate problem of getting everyone safely across the gap. Using the rope system I'd rigged, I successfully guided Dr. Warner and then my father across the ravine. My mother crossed with surprising agility, and I brought up the rear, retrieving our safety equipment as I came. For the next 2 hours, the trail became progressively more difficult. The altitude was affecting everyone differently. Dr. Werner was struggling with shortness of breath, my father was developing signs of dehydration despite regular water breaks, and even my mother's earlier determination was beginning to show cracks. But I felt strong. The combination of my recent medical training, my natural fitness, and my growing confidence in emergency situations seemed to have prepared me perfectly for exactly this kind of crisis. I found myself constantly monitoring everyone else's condition, adjusting our pace, and making decisions about when to rest and when to push forward. It was during one of these rest stops, while I was checking Dr. Werner's pulse and giving him altitude sickness medication, that I heard the sound that changed everything. Helicopter rotors in the distance.
That's not our extraction, my father said, checking his GPS coordinates against the predetermined rendezvous point. We're still 4 kilometers from the mining station. The sound was coming from behind us, back towards Zelenova, and it was getting closer. Crimson Brigade reconnaissance, Dr. Warner said grimly. They use helicopters to track fleeing civilians and aid workers. If they spot us on this trail... He didn't need to finish the sentence. We all knew what the Crimson Brigade did to captured humanitarian workers. The recent reports from other regions had been too horrific to ignore. We need to get off the main trail, I said, studying the topographical map Bear Morrison had given me during our security briefing. There's a secondary path that runs through the forest. It's longer, but it provides cover from aerial surveillance. That's when my parents revealed exactly what kind of people they really were, and exactly how expendable they considered everyone, including their own daughter, when their own survival was at stake. The decision they made in that moment would haunt me for the rest of my life. But it would also teach me the most important lesson I've ever learned about the difference between who people pretend to be and who they actually are when everything is on the line.
What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity of a nightmare where you're watching yourself fall but can't wake up to stop it. As we prepared to leave the main trail for the forest route, the helicopter sounds grew closer, and I could see the panic building in everyone's eyes. Dr. Werner was breathing heavily, clearly struggling with the altitude and exertion. My father kept checking his watch obsessively, calculating arrival times and extraction windows with the cold precision of someone treating human lives like logistics problems. I was studying the topographical map, plotting our route through the forest canopy that would provide cover from aerial surveillance, when I heard my mother's voice cut through the mountain air with words that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. Jonathan, we need to make a decision now. If we take the forest route with them, we'll miss the extraction window. The helicopter won't wait. I know, my father replied, his voice carrying that familiar tone of corporate efficiency that I'd heard him use during business calls my entire life. We need to prioritize mission success. I looked up from the map, confused. What do you mean? The mission is getting everyone to safety. Riley, my mother said, and I could see something in her expression that I'd never seen before, a coldness that seemed to freeze the spring air around us. The mission is getting the Thornfield humanitarian leadership to safety so we can continue our work helping people. We can't help anyone if we're dead. Dr. Werner is part of our team, I said, still not understanding what they were suggesting. We all go together or we don't go at all. My father checked his GPS again, then looked directly at me with eyes that seemed to belong to a stranger. Riley, you're being naive. Dr. Werner can't keep up the pace we need to make the extraction point. If we slow down for him, we all die. If we maintain the necessary speed, we save the people who can continue the humanitarian work. The magnitude of what they were suggesting hit me like a physical blow. They wanted to abandon Dr. Werner, the man who had spent 6 months away from his family to provide medical care to people in desperate need, the man who had praised my emergency medical skills and encouraged me to consider medical school, the man who was struggling with altitude sickness precisely because he had volunteered to help people in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. You can't be serious, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Riley, this is exactly the kind of difficult decision that humanitarian leaders have to make, my mother said, her tone taking on the patronizing quality she used when she thought she was teaching me important life lessons. Sometimes helping the most people means making personal sacrifices. Personal sacrifices? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're talking about leaving Dr. Werner to die. That's not a personal sacrifice. That's murder. Don't be dramatic, my father snapped. Dr. Werner is a grown man who knew the risks when he volunteered for this mission. We're not responsible for his poor physical conditioning. That's when I realized they had already made their decision. They weren't debating whether to abandon Dr. Werner. They were trying to convince me to go along with it. And as I looked at their faces, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. They were calculating whether I was worth saving either. Dr. Werner, who had been sitting on a boulder trying to catch his breath, looked up at us with growing comprehension of what he was hearing. Please, he said quietly, I understand I'm slowing you down, but
Riley has been helping me manage the altitude sickness if I can just take a few more minutes to rest. We don't have a few more minutes, my mother cut him off. The helicopter is on a strict schedule. If we're not there within the extraction window, they leave. That's not negotiable. I know. I pulled out the satellite phone Bear Morrison had given me, the one I'd been carrying as backup emergency communication. Then we call for an alternative extraction. We radio the coalition forces and request evacuation for all 4 team members. My father's hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, his grip tight enough to bruise. Riley, put the phone away. We're not calling for additional resources when we have a perfectly viable extraction option available. For who? I demanded, jerking my arm away from his grip. For the people who can survive the journey, my mother said with devastating finality. Riley, you need to understand something about humanitarian work that we haven't taught you yet. Sometimes, helping the most people means ensuring that the people with the most capacity to help others survive to continue that work. I stared at her in horror. Are you listening to yourself? You're talking about letting Dr. Werner die so you can continue taking photos of yourselves helping people. That's enough, my father said sharply. Riley, you're either part of this team or you're not, but we're not risking the entire mission for one person who can't keep up. The helicopter sounds were getting closer, and I could see the panic in Dr. Werner's eyes as he realized that the people he had trusted with his life were actively discussing abandoning him. But what happened next revealed the true depth of my parents' calculation. There's another problem, she said, looking directly at me with an expression that made my heart stop. Riley, you've been slowing us down too with all these medical checks and safety precautions. If we're going to make the extraction point in time, we need to move at maximum speed with no stops.
I haven't been slowing anyone down, I protested. I've been keeping Dr. Werner alive and making sure no one falls off a cliff. Exactly, my father said. And that's admirable, but it's not compatible with survival in this situation. You need to choose, Riley. Come with us and leave the medical drama behind, or stay here and play nurse to someone who's going to die anyway. The words hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to abandon Dr. Werner, they were threatening to abandon me too if I didn't go along with their plan. That's when I understood the full scope of what I was seeing. My parents weren't just revealing themselves to be capable of abandoning a team member to save themselves. They were revealing that their love for me was exactly as conditional and calculating as their love for everyone else. I was valuable to them as long as I enhanced their mission and their image. The moment I became inconvenient or demanded they act according to their stated principles rather than their actual priorities, I became expendable too. You're talking about leaving me behind too, I said, the words coming out as a statement rather than a question. We're talking about making sure the people who can contribute to future humanitarian efforts survive this situation, my mother replied, not denying what I'd understood. If you can't keep up without stopping to provide medical care to every person who's struggling, then yes, you're choosing to stay behind. Dr. Werner looked at me with eyes full of desperate gratitude and said quietly, Riley, if you stay to help me, we both might die. If you go with them, at least you survive to help other people. I looked at this man who was offering to sacrifice himself to save me, then at my parents who were threatening to sacrifice me to save themselves, and I realized I was seeing the fundamental difference between people who actually care about others and people who just perform caring for their own benefit. The sound of the Crimson Brigade helicopter was close enough now that we could see it through the trees, searching the trail we just abandoned. My parents grabbed their packs and started moving toward the forest route without another word, clearly expecting me to follow. Instead, I knelt beside Dr. Werner and opened my medical kit. Riley, what are you doing? My father called back. I'm staying with Dr. Werner, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. And I'm calling for our own extraction. That's when my mother said the words that would haunt me forever. Then you're choosing to die for someone who doesn't matter. That's not humanitarian work, Riley. That's just stupidity. They disappeared into the forest without looking back, leaving me alone on a mountain trail with an injured colleague, enemy forces closing in,
and the devastating knowledge that my parents valued their own survival more than mine. But as I activated Bear Morrison's satellite phone and began transmitting our GPS coordinates to coalition emergency frequencies, I realized something that would change everything. For the first time in my life, I was about to discover what I was actually capable of when I wasn't trying to meet someone else's expectations. The moment my parents disappeared into the forest, leaving Dr. Warner and me alone on that mountain trail, with the sound of enemy helicopters growing closer, something fundamental shifted inside me. For 26 years, I had been Riley Thornfield, dutiful daughter who measured her worth by her parents' approval. In that instant, watching them abandon us without a backwanged glance, I became someone else entirely. Riley Thornfield, person who would rather die with her principles intact than live as a coward. My hands were shaking as I activated Bear Morrison's satellite phone, but my voice was steady when the emergency frequency crackled to life. Coalition Emergency Response. This is Riley Thornfield with International Relief Coalition Medical Team, requesting immediate extraction. 2 personnel stranded on Mountain Trail, grid reference 4278 Alpha. 1 team member experiencing altitude sickness, enemy forces approaching our position. Please confirm receipt. The response came through with blessed clarity. Riley Thornfield, this is Bear Morrison, Coalition Special Operations. I have your position locked. Bravo team is en route to your coordinates. Estimated arrival 12 minutes. Can you hold your position? Hearing Bear's voice through that satellite phone felt like being thrown a lifeline while drowning. This man who had seen something in me during our brief meeting in Denver was now coordinating my rescue from halfway around the world. Bear, it's really you, I said, unable to keep the relief out of my voice. Yes, Riley, it's me. I've been monitoring coalition emergency frequencies since your team's evacuation was announced. Where are your parents and the rest of your medical team? I looked at Dr. Warner, who was listening to every word with obvious confusion about why I seemed to have a direct line to Special Operations Command. I said, they continued to the primary extraction point. Dr. Warner was experiencing severe altitude sickness, so I stayed behind to provide medical support. There was a pause on Bear's end, and I could almost hear him processing what I wasn't saying directly. Riley, I need you to understand something. Bravo team is going to extract you and Dr. Warner regardless of any other considerations. Your safety is the priority. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I understand perfectly. Bear was telling me that whatever my parents had made, whatever they had said or done, the coalition forces would not abandon me the way they had. I understand, I replied. Bear, how did you know to monitor emergency frequencies for our team?
Because I've been doing this work for 22 years, and I've learned to trust my instincts about people. 3 weeks ago, I gave you that satellite phone because something told me you might need it. Today, I was monitoring coalition communications because something told me your family might make decisions that would put you at risk. Dr. Werner was staring at me with growing amazement. Riley, who is this man? How do you have direct communication with special operations? He's the security consultant who briefed our team before deployment, I explained. He gave me emergency communication equipment as a precaution. Your parents never mentioned that you had independent communication capabilities. My parents don't know about it, I admitted. Bear gave it to me privately. The implication hung in the air between us. Dr. Warner was beginning to understand that there had been layers to our team dynamics that he hadn't been aware of, and that those dynamics had just played out in the most dramatic way possible. The sound of the Crimson Brigade helicopter was getting closer, and I could see through the trees that they were conducting a systematic search pattern of the trail we'd abandoned. We had maybe 5 minutes before they reached our section. Dr. Warner, I said, checking his pulse and respiration, I need you to help me understand something. When my parents were discussing leaving you behind, you didn't seem surprised. Have you seen this kind of behavior from humanitarian leaders before? He was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Riley, your parents aren't evil people, but they're not humanitarian workers either. They're humanitarian entrepreneurs. There's a difference that most people in this field understand, but don't talk about openly. What do you mean?
Humanitarian entrepreneurs are people who use charitable work to build personal brands and social capital. They care about impact, but they care more about credit for impact. They help people, but they help themselves more. When faced with a choice between doing the right thing and protecting their investment in their own image, they choose their image. This analysis cut straight to the heart of everything I'd been feeling about my family's approach to charitable work, but had never been able to articulate. So you've been watching them this whole time, knowing what they were? I've been watching you, Dr. Warner corrected. Riley, I volunteered for this mission specifically because I heard about the young woman who was developing sustainable community health programs and had emergency medical training. I wanted to work with you, not your parents. This revelation was almost as shocking as my parents' abandonment. You came to Carvenia to work with me? The medical community talks, Riley. Word gets around when someone demonstrates exceptional capabilities in the field. Your work in Zelenova, the way you handled trauma cases, your approach to building local medical capacity, that's the kind of humanitarian work that actually changes lives. Bear's voice crackled through the satellite phone again. Riley, Bravo team has visual on your position. You should see them coming up the trail from the south in about 3 minutes. I need you to identify yourselves clearly when they approach. I looked down the mountain trail and saw them, 6 figures in combat gear, moving with the fluid precision of elite military units. Even from a distance, I could see that these men were operating on a completely different level from anyone I'd ever encountered. Dr. Warner, I said, checking his pulse and respiration, we're about to be rescued by Navy SEALs. Navy SEALs? He looked at me with new understanding. Riley, who exactly is this Bear Morrison to you? I think I said slowly, he's someone who saw something in me that I didn't even know was there. The first SEAL reached our position exactly 3 minutes later, moving up that treacherous mountain trail like it was a sidewalk. He was compact, efficient, and radiated the kind of competence that made everything feel instantly more manageable. Riley Thornfield? He asked, though it wasn't really a question. That's me. I'm Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, Bravo team leader. Bear Morrison sends his regards and instructions to get you out of here immediately. He was already assessing Dr. Warner's condition while speaking. Doctor, can you walk with assistance? I believe so, Dr. Warner replied. Outstanding. We have a helicopter landing zone secured about 2 clicks north of here. The area will be clear of hostile forces for the next 40 minutes. Rodriguez turned to me. Riley, Bear wants me to tell you something specific. He said to tell you that the decisions you made today define who you are, not the decisions other people made. He also said you should consider that medical school application when you get home. Standing on that mountain trail, surrounded by elite soldiers who had risked their lives to rescue me, I realized that Bear Morrison had given me more than emergency communication equipment. He had given me a glimpse of what it looked like when people kept their promises, honored their commitments, and measured their worth by their actions rather than their publicity. Sergeant Rodriguez, I said, when we get to safety, I want to learn everything I can about how people like you and Bear decide what's worth risking their lives for. He smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from anyone since my parents had walked away. That's a conversation worth having, but first let's get you home alive so you can have it. As Bravo team began moving us toward the secure extraction point, I realized that I was no longer the person who had started this mission. The daughter who had spent her life seeking approval from people who saw her as expendable was gone. In her place was someone who had chosen to risk everything for a colleague in need and had been rescued by people who understood that choice.
I had no idea yet what I would do with this transformation, but I knew with absolute certainty that I would never again allow anyone to treat my principles as negotiable or my life as expendable. The helicopter ride to the coalition base in Prestova felt like crossing between 2 different worlds. In one world, I was the abandoned daughter of humanitarian celebrities who had calculated my worth and found it insufficient. In the other world, I was someone whose principles had earned the respect of elite military professionals who understood the difference between performance and character. Sergeant Rodriguez sat across from me during the flight, occasionally checking on Dr. Werner's condition, but mostly observing me with the kind of assessment I'd learned to recognize from medical professionals evaluating a patient's stability. But he wasn't assessing my physical condition. He was evaluating something deeper. "Riley," he said over the helicopter noise, "Bear wants to debrief with you as soon as we reach base. He's flying in from Ramstein specifically to meet with you." "Why?" I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. "Because what happened today wasn't an accident or a panicked decision. Your parents made calculated choices based on their priorities, and those choices revealed information that Bear needs to understand fully." Dr. Werner, who was looking much better after receiving oxygen and IV fluids from the SEAL medic, leaned forward. "Riley, I think there are things about this situation that you don't know yet." "What do you mean?" Rodriguez and Dr. Werner exchanged a look that suggested they'd been having conversations during the rescue operation that I hadn't been part of. "Tell her," Rodriguez said simply. Dr. Werner took a deep breath. "Riley, Bear Morrison contacted me 2 weeks ago, before we even left for Carvinia. He wanted to know about your medical training, your capabilities in the field, and your family's decision-making patterns under stress." I stared at him. Bear was investigating my family? "Bear was protecting you," Rodriguez corrected. "He runs security for humanitarian operations in conflict zones. Part of that job is identifying potential risks to team members, including risks from other team members." The implications of what they were telling me began to sink in. "You're saying Bear suspected my parents might abandon me?" "He suspected your parents might make decisions that prioritize their own survival over team welfare," Dr. Werner explained carefully. "How could he possibly have known?" Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and showed me a file that made my stomach drop. It contained detailed background information on my family's humanitarian missions, including incident reports I'd never seen before. "Kenya, 2019, Rodriguez read. "Local staff reported that Jonathan and Victoria Thornfield abandoned a planned medical clinic when government forces approached, leaving local volunteers to secure supplies and equipment alone." "Guatemala, 2020, Dr. Verno continued reading from the file. "Team physician Dr. Sarah Keller filed a complaint alleging that the Thornfields prioritized media documentation over patient care during a cholera outbreak, resulting in delayed treatment for critically ill children." "Bangladesh, 2021, Rodriguez added. "Village elder Rashid Ahmed reported that the Thornfields terminated their water purification project early when local political tensions increased, despite having committed to a 6-month presence." I listened to this recitation of incidents with growing horror. How did Bear get access to these reports? Because Bear Morrison isn't just a security consultant. He's the lead investigator for Coalition Ethics Review Board. When humanitarian organizations request security support for high-risk missions, his team evaluates not just the external threats, but the internal team dynamics that might create additional dangers. You're telling me my parents have a history of abandoning projects and people when situations become difficult? We're telling you that your parents have a documented pattern of prioritizing their own safety and image over their stated humanitarian commitments, Dr. Werner said gently. And Bear identified you as someone who was likely to be put at risk by that pattern. The helicopter was approaching the Coalition base, a sprawling compound of temporary structures and landing pads carved into a mountain valley. As we prepared to land, Rodriguez handed me a secure communicator. "Bear wants to speak with you before we debrief officially. This conversation is off the record, no documentation, no reports, just information that you need to have." Bear's voice came through the communicator with crystal clarity. "Riley, first question. Are you injured?" "No, I'm fine. Dr. Werner is stable." "Bear, I need to understand what's happening here. What's happening is that you made a choice today that revealed your true character, and that choice is going to change your life in ways you haven't imagined yet. But first, I need you to answer some questions honestly. Okay. Did your parents know about your emergency medical training before this mission? No. I told them I was taking cultural sensitivity training. Did they know about the satellite phone I gave you? No. I kept it as personal emergency equipment. Good. Riley, I'm going to tell you something that's going to be difficult to hear, but you need to understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. Your parents didn't just abandon you today. They reported to Coalition Command that you and Dr. Werner were killed in the Crimson Brigade attack. The words hit me like a physical blow. What? They reached the primary extraction point and told the helicopter crew that they were the only survivors. They reported that you and Dr. Werner were captured by enemy forces and presumed dead. I couldn't speak. The magnitude of what my parents had done was beyond anything I'd imagined possible. Bear, Dr. Werner's voice came through the communicator. Are you saying they filed false casualty reports? I'm saying they told everyone who would listen that their daughter died a hero trying to save her colleague, rather than admitting they abandoned both of you to save themselves. Why would they do that? I managed to ask. Because dead heroes are better for their image than abandoned daughters who might tell inconvenient truths about their character. Rodriguez was watching my face as I processed this information. Riley, there's more. Your parents are already back in the United States. They've scheduled interviews with major news networks to discuss their harrowing escape and the tragic loss of their heroic daughter. They're using my supposed death for publicity? They're using your supposed death to position themselves as grieving humanitarian heroes who barely survived a terrorist attack, Bear confirmed. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, they're booked solid for the next 2 weeks. Dr. Werner looked at me with something approaching awe. Riley, do you understand what this means? You have the power to expose everything they've done, not just today, but throughout their entire career. But more importantly, Bear's voice continued, you have the power to decide who you want to become now that you're free from their expectations and control. The question is, what do you want to do with that power? I looked around the helicopter at these men who had risked their lives to save me, who had treated me with more respect and honesty in the past 4 hours than my parents had shown me in 26 years. I want to learn, I said finally. I want to understand how people like you make decisions about what's worth fighting for and what's worth risking everything to protect. That, Rodriguez said with a smile, is exactly what Bear hoped you'd say. As the helicopter touched down at the Coalition Base Command Center, I realized that my parents had given me the greatest gift possible, though they hadn't intended it that way. By abandoning me, they had freed me to discover who I really was and what I was actually capable of becoming. The strategic phase of my transformation was about to begin, and I had allies who understood that revenge isn't about destruction. It's about building something better from the ashes of what was destroyed. The Coalition Base Command Center became my war room for the next 72 hours. While my parents were in the United States building their narrative of heroic survival and tragic loss, I was systematically dismantling every lie they'd ever told about their humanitarian work. Bear Morrison arrived at the base 18 hours after our rescue, carrying files that contained 3 years of documentation I never knew existed. As we spread the evidence across a conference table in the Secure Communications building, I began to understand the full scope of what my parents had been doing throughout their entire humanitarian career. This is what real investigative work looks like, Bear explained, pointing to a thick folder labeled Thornfield Operations Analysis. Every mission, every project, every claim they've made about their humanitarian impact. My team has been building this file since 2021. The evidence was devastating. Photos showed construction projects abandoned halfway through completion, with local communities left to finish work with no resources.
Financial records revealed that less than 30% of donated funds actually reached the communities they were supposed to help, with the rest going to administrative costs that included luxury accommodations and first-class travel for my parents. But the most damning evidence was the testimonials from people they'd claimed to help. Village leaders in Cambodia describing how the Thornfields had left suddenly when a wildlife documentary crew offered them a more photogenic project. Teachers in Guatemala explaining how promised educational materials never arrived after my parents returned to the United States. Community health workers in Bangladesh detailing how medical equipment was removed from their clinic when my parents decided the logistics were too complicated. Riley, Dr. Werner said, studying a particularly brutal report from a village elder in Cambodia, your parents haven't been doing humanitarian work. They've been extracting humanitarian experiences for their own benefit. While Bear and Dr. Werner continued analyzing the historical evidence, I focused on what was happening in real time. Using the coalition's intelligence monitoring capabilities, we tracked every interview my parents gave, every statement they made, every detail of the story they were telling about their heroic escape from Carvania. The narrative they had constructed was masterful in its manipulation. According to their version of events, they had tried desperately to save me and Dr. Werner, but were forced to make the agonizing decision to continue to the extraction point when we were overrun by Crimson Brigade forces. They described hearing gunfire and explosions from our position, making it impossible to return for us. She died doing what she loved most, my mother told Anderson Cooper in an interview that aired while I was sitting in a military command center, very much alive. My father's performance on Fox News was even more elaborate. The last thing Riley said to us was, "Go, make sure our work continues." She understood that sometimes humanitarian leaders have to make impossible sacrifices to ensure the mission succeeds. Watching these interviews felt surreal. My parents were grieving a version of me that never existed, the perfect humanitarian daughter who would sacrifice herself for their mission rather than admitting they abandoned both of you to save themselves.
But they had made a critical error in their narrative construction, and Bear was the first to identify it. "Look at the timeline they're giving," he said, pulling up transcripts from their various interviews. "They're claiming they heard gunfire and explosions from your position at 14:30 local time, but coalition records show no Crimson Brigade activity in that sector until 16:45. Dr. Werner looked up from his own analysis. "They're also claiming they tried to radio for assistance for you, but I was monitoring our team frequencies the entire time. They never called for help. More importantly," I added, studying the satellite phone logs Bear had obtained, "they never tried to contact me directly, even though they knew I had emergency communication equipment." This was when Rodriguez, who had been quietly coordinating with his team throughout our investigation, made a suggestion that changed everything. "Riley, what if we let them continue building their false narrative while we build documentation of the truth? The more elaborate their story becomes, the more devastating it will be when the evidence contradicts every detail." "What kind of documentation?" "Everything. Satellite tracking data showing your exact position and timeline. Audio recordings of coalition communications during the rescue operation. Medical records proving Dr. Werner was treated for altitude sickness, not combat injuries. Video evidence from the rescue helicopter showing you both very much alive." Bear nodded approvingly. "Plus all the historical evidence of their pattern of abandonment and the witness statements from people they've left behind in previous missions. You're talking about building a comprehensive case that exposes not just what they did to me, but everything they've been doing for years," I said. "Exactly. But more than that," Rodriguez continued, "we document your actual capabilities and accomplishments independent of their narrative. Your emergency medical training, your work in Zelenova, your leadership during the crisis, your decision to stay with Dr. Werner despite the risk." This was when Dr. Werner made a suggestion that took the plan to an entirely different level. "Riley, I've been corresponding with colleagues at Johns Hopkins, Seattle General, and Massachusetts General Hospital.
When word gets out about your medical work in Carvania and your performance during the crisis, you're going to have opportunities that go far beyond anything your parents could have provided. What do you mean? I mean accelerated admission to medical school programs that specialize in emergency medicine and humanitarian healthcare. I mean research opportunities with organizations that focus on sustainable community health development. I mean a career path that's based on your actual skills and commitment, not your family connections. Bear pulled out a secure tablet and showed me something that made my breath catch. Riley, I've been authorized to offer you a position with the Coalition Ethics Review Board. You'd be trained in humanitarian oversight, crisis response, and ethics investigation. Your job would be ensuring that what your parents did to you never happens to anyone else. The offer was stunning, not just because of the professional opportunity, but because it represented validation from people whose opinions were based on competence rather than connections. Think about it, Rodriguez added. While your parents are building their careers on lies about your sacrifice, you could be building a real career preventing the kind of abandonment they normalized. Over the next 48 hours, while my parents continued their media tour, we methodically built what Bear called the most comprehensive documentation of humanitarian fraud in coalition history. Every claim they made was cross-referenced with evidence. Every emotional detail of their story was contradicted by hard data. But the most powerful element of our documentation wasn't the evidence of their lies, it was the evidence of who I actually was and what I was actually capable of achieving. Medical evaluations showing my advanced trauma response capabilities, testimonials from villagers in Zelenova describing my community health work, video recordings of my performance during the rescue operation, academic transcripts showing my preparation for medical school applications. The story isn't just that your parents lied about you. The story is that they lied about someone who was already building the kind of humanitarian career they only pretended to have. By the end of our preparation phase, I had everything I needed to expose my parents completely. But more importantly, I had everything I needed to launch the life I actually wanted, independent of their recognition or approval. The question was no longer whether I could destroy their carefully constructed image. The question was whether exposing them would serve the larger purpose of building something better from the wreckage of their deception. As I prepared for what would be the most important decision of my life, I realized that my parents had given me a gift they never intended, the freedom to discover what I was actually capable of when I wasn't trying to meet their expectations. The confrontation happened exactly 1 week after my parents had declared me dead to the world. They were scheduled to appear at the International Humanitarian Awards Gala in Washington, D.C., where they would be receiving the Distinguished Service Medal for their heroic leadership during the Carvania crisis and their tragic sacrifice of their beloved daughter. Bear Morrison had arranged for me to attend as a special coalition representative, with credentials that would get me access to the main presentation stage. What my parents didn't know was that the International Relief Coalition had quietly contacted the gala organizers, presenting evidence that would transform their moment of triumph into their complete destruction.
I stood in the wings of the Kennedy Center Opera House, watching through the side curtains as my parents took the stage to thunderous applause. They looked exactly like what they'd always been, polished performers who had perfected the art of humanitarian theater. My father wore his perfectly tailored tuxedo with a black ribbon pinned to his lapel, symbolizing grief for his lost daughter. My mother had chosen an elegant black gown that suggested dignified mourning while still photographing beautifully. "Ladies and gentlemen," the presenter announced, "Jonathan and Victoria Thornfield represent the highest ideals of humanitarian service. In the face of unimaginable tragedy and personal loss, they continued their mission to serve others, demonstrating the kind of selfless courage that defines true humanitarian leadership." The audience of 1,200 humanitarian workers, donors, and dignitaries rose in standing ovation. Camera flashes illuminated my parents as they approached the podium, their expressions perfectly calibrated to convey humble gratitude mixed with profound grief. My father stepped to the microphone first, his voice carrying that familiar tone of controlled emotion that I'd heard him use in countless donor presentations. "Thank you for this incredible honor," he began. "Victoria and I accept this award not for ourselves, but in memory of our daughter Riley, who gave her life in service to the people of Carvenia. She died as she lived, putting others before herself, embodying the humanitarian spirit that we hope will inspire future generations." The applause was deafening. I watched from the wings as my parents basked in recognition for my supposed sacrifice, using my death as the emotional climax of their carefully constructed narrative. That's when the gala organizer stepped back to the podium with an expression that should have warned my parents that something was wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "before we conclude tonight's presentation, we have a special video message from the Coalition's Special Operations team that was involved in the Carvenia rescue operations." The massive screen behind my parents lit up with Bear Morrison's face, speaking from the Coalition Command Center where I'd spent the past week building our evidence file. "Good evening. I'm Captain Daniel Morrison, Coalition Special Operations. I'm speaking to you tonight because the story you just heard contains significant inaccuracies that need to be corrected." I watched my parents' faces as they slowly turned to look at the screen, and for the first time in my life, I saw them experience genuine terror. They had no idea what was coming, but they knew it was bad. Riley Thornfield did not die in Carvenia. She was not killed by enemy forces. She was abandoned by her parents when they decided that her humanitarian principles were incompatible with their personal survival. The audience began murmuring as Bear's words sank in. My parents stood frozen at the podium, unsure whether to flee or try to maintain their composure. Furthermore, Coalition investigation has revealed that Jonathan and Victoria Thornfield have engaged in systematic humanitarian fraud for more than 3 years, abandoning projects and communities while claiming credit for work they never completed. The video presentation continued with devastating precision. Satellite tracking data showing the exact timeline of our separation. Audio recordings of my parents discussing leaving Dr. Warner behind. Video footage from the rescue helicopter showing me and Dr. Warner very much alive. But the most damaging evidence was the testimonials from people my parents had claimed to help. Village leaders from Kenya, Guatemala, and Bangladesh appeared on screen describing how the Thornfields had abandoned them when situations became difficult or when more photogenic opportunities arose. The Thornfield humanitarian empire, Bear concluded, was built on exploitation of the communities they claimed to serve and manipulation of the donors who trusted them to deliver aid. As the video ended, the audience sat in stunned silence. My parents were still standing at the podium, their carefully constructed facade crumbling in real time as 1,200 people processed the magnitude of their deception. That's when I walked onto the stage. The sound that rose from the audience was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a collective gasp of shock and disbelief that seemed to shake the opera house itself. Camera flashes exploded as photographers captured the impossible image of the supposed dead daughter confronting her parents on live television. I walked slowly to the center of the stage, my emergency medical certification badge pinned to my dress jacket, alongside the Coalition's Ethics Review Board credentials Bear had presented to me the day before. I wasn't the abandoned daughter anymore, or the dutiful humanitarian accessory. I was Dr. Riley Thornfield, because Johns Hopkins had expedited my medical school admission after reviewing my fieldwork in Carvenia. "Hello, Mom." "Hello, Dad," I said into the microphone, my voice carrying clearly through the silent opera house. "I'm sure you're surprised to see me, since you told everyone I was dead." My father tried to speak, but no words came out. My mother's perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the color draining from her face. "I want everyone here to understand something," I addressed the audience rather than my parents. "These two people didn't just lie about my death. They abandoned me and Dr. Warner on a mountain trail because we were slowing down their escape. They chose their own survival over their stated principles, and then they used our supposed deaths to enhance their reputation." I pulled out a folder containing the evidence Bear and I had compiled. This documentation shows a pattern of abandonment that spans their entire humanitarian career.
Communities left without promised aid, projects terminated when they became inconvenient, local staff abandoned when situations became dangerous. Riley, my mother finally managed to speak, her voice barely audible, you don't understand the pressures we were under.
I understand perfectly, I replied. You were under pressure to choose between your image and your integrity. You chose your image. But what you didn't understand is that integrity isn't something you can perform for cameras. It's something you demonstrate when you think no one is watching. I turned back to the audience. Real humanitarian work isn't about building your own reputation. It's about building capacity in communities so they don't need you anymore. It's about staying when things get difficult instead of leaving when they stop being photogenic. It's about measuring success by lives improved, not publicity generated. The standing ovation began, slowly, with individuals throughout the audience rising to their feet. Within minutes, the entire opera house was applauding while my parents stood frozen at the podium, their Distinguished Service Medal lying forgotten on the floor where my father had dropped it. The Coalition's Ethics Review Board will be conducting a full investigation of Thornfield humanitarian operations, I announced as the applause died down. All donors who contributed to their projects will receive detailed reports about how their money was actually used, and all communities they abandoned will receive the support they were originally promised. As I walked off the stage, I passed close enough to my parents to say quietly, "You taught me that humanitarian work is about serving others. Thank you for that lesson. I'm sorry you never learned it yourselves." Security escorted my parents from the building as the gala organizers announced that their award was being rescinded. I watched from the lobby as they were surrounded by reporters shouting questions about their deception, their abandonment tactics, and their exploitation of communities they'd claimed to help. But I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected from their public destruction. Instead, I felt something much more powerful. The freedom that comes from finally being able to build a life based on what you actually believe, rather than what others expect you to perform. Bear Morrison appeared beside me as the chaos continued outside. "How does it feel to get justice?" he asked. "It feels like the beginning. Justice isn't just about exposing what's wrong. It's about building something better from what's left." He smiled. "That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." "When do you start medical school?" "Next month. And when I graduate, I'm going back to Zelenova. Katerina is waiting for me to help build that community health program the right way." "Now that," Bear said, "sounds like real humanitarian work." 5 years later, I'm writing this story from a medical clinic in Zelenova, the same mountain village where my journey toward authentic humanitarian work began. The clinic bears a small bronze plaque that reads, "Katerina Vesky Community Health Center," named for the village elder who taught me that real humanitarian work is about serving people, not serving your own image of yourself as a savior. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Medical school at Johns Hopkins was the most challenging thing I'd ever attempted, but also the most rewarding. I specialized in emergency medicine with a focus on community health systems, developing expertise in the exact kind of sustainable healthcare infrastructure I'd envisioned during those first weeks in Carvania. My professors knew my story. It had become something of a case study in humanitarian ethics courses across the country. But they also knew my capabilities, which had been documented thoroughly during my rescue and subsequent work with the Coalition Ethics Review Board. I wasn't admitted to medical school because of what happened to me. I was admitted because of what I'd proven I could do, despite what happened to me. The work was intense. Emergency medicine requires split-second decision-making under extreme pressure, precise technical skills, and the ability to remain calm when everyone around you is panicking. But every technique I mastered, every procedure I learned, every crisis management protocol I developed, I knew would eventually serve people who desperately needed medical care in places where resources were limited and stakes were life and death.
During my residency at Seattle General Hospital's Trauma Center, I continued working with Bear Morrison and the Coalition Ethics Review Board, helping to develop new oversight protocols for humanitarian organizations operating in conflict zones. We created mandatory ethical training programs, established whistleblower protection systems, and implemented monitoring procedures that would prevent the kind of abandonment my parents had normalized. The investigation into Thornfield humanitarian operations took 3 years to complete, but the results were comprehensive. Their organization was permanently disbanded, their nonprofit status revoked, and they were required to pay restitution to every community they had abandoned. More importantly, the donors who had trusted them received detailed accounting of how their money was actually used versus how it was supposed to be used. My parents never contacted me during this period. I learned through coalition updates that they had attempted to rebuild their reputation by blaming their actions on post-traumatic stress from the Carvania crisis. But their documented history of abandonment made that narrative impossible to sustain. They eventually moved to a suburban community in Arizona where they've lived quietly under the supervision of a court-appointed ethics monitor. I don't hate them. Hatred would require caring about their opinions, and I realized years ago that their opinions were irrelevant to my life. They taught me, through their negative example, exactly what I never wanted to become. In that sense, they gave me the greatest gift possible: clarity about my own values and the determination to live according to them.
The community health center I run in Zelenova operates on principles that are the exact opposite of everything my parents practiced. Instead of extracting humanitarian experiences for external recognition, we build local capacity so that international intervention becomes unnecessary. Instead of prioritizing publicity over patient care, we measure success by the number of community health workers we train to work independently. Our medical staff is entirely local, trained in emergency procedures and community health management. I serve as consulting physician and systems coordinator, but the clinic belongs to the community, not to me. When I eventually leave, and sustainable humanitarian work requires planning your own departure from the beginning, the clinic will continue operating at full capacity because the people who live here will have all the skills and resources they need to run it themselves. The model we've developed in Zelenova has been replicated in 17 other communities across Eastern Europe and Central Asia, all operating according to the same principle. The goal of humanitarian work is to work yourself out of a job by building local capabilities that make outside intervention unnecessary. Dr. Werner, who became my unofficial mentor throughout medical school, visits twice a year to evaluate our programs and help train new community health coordinators. He's in his 70s now, but still demonstrates the kind of authentic commitment to service that my parents never understood. Last month, he told me something that captured perfectly what our work represents. "Riley," he said, "the difference between real humanitarian work and humanitarian performance is simple. Performance is about what you can get from the communities you serve. Real humanitarian work is about what you can give to those communities that they'll still have after you're gone." The bronze plaque in our medical center lobby lists every person who helped make our work possible. Bear Morrison, who saw potential in me before I knew it existed, Sergeant Rodriguez and Bravo team, who demonstrated what it means to risk everything for people you barely know. The villagers of Zelenova, who taught me that healing comes from many sources, not just Western medicine. And Katerina Vesky, who showed me that wisdom and strength often come disguised as quiet village elders who smell like cinnamon and lavender. But there's another name on that plaque that might surprise people who know my story: Jonathan and Victoria Thornfield. Not because they contributed to our work, but because their betrayal forced me to discover who I actually was when I stopped trying to meet other people's expectations. The irony isn't lost on me that my parents' greatest failure became the foundation for my greatest success. By abandoning me on that mountain trail, they freed me to build the kind of life and career that would have been impossible if I'd remained trapped in their world of performative humanitarianism.
I learned something that night in the mountains that has shaped every decision I've made since. You discover who you really are, not when people support you, but when they abandon you. You find out what you're actually capable of, not when things go according to plan, but when everything falls apart and you have to improvise your way to survival. The work I do now, training community health workers, developing sustainable medical systems, building local capacity for emergency response, this is who I always was underneath the carefully constructed image of the dutiful humanitarian daughter. My parents didn't create my capabilities. They just prevented me from discovering them until circumstances forced that discovery. Every month, I receive messages from people who've heard my story and are facing their own moments of betrayal and abandonment. They want to know how to survive when the people who are supposed to protect them choose their own interests instead. They want to know how to build something meaningful from the wreckage of broken trust. I tell them what Bear Morrison told me that first day. The decisions you make when you're abandoned define who you are, not the decisions other people make about abandoning you. The question isn't whether you can survive betrayal. The question is what you'll build from the strength you discover when survival becomes your only option. I tell them what Katerina taught me. Healing comes from many sources, and sometimes the most powerful medicine is simply refusing to let other people's limitations define your possibilities. And I tell them what I learned on my own. The best revenge isn't destroying the people who betrayed you. The best revenge is thriving in the life they tried to prevent you from living. Have you ever had to rebuild your life from complete betrayal? Have you discovered capabilities you never knew you had when everything familiar was stripped away? Share your story in the comments. And remember, sometimes the people who abandon you are actually setting you free to become who you are always meant to be. My name is Dr. Riley Thornfield, and I'm living proof that the worst thing that ever happens to you might also be the best thing that ever happens to you if you have the courage to see the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.